So welcome to the October 18th Rust CTCFT. I'm your host, Nico Matsakis, and today we have a wonderful lineup for you. We're going to be going through different ways and things that have been happening around empowering and organizing open source contributors. We have Tyler Mandry talking about some of the work that's been happening in the Async Foundations working group. We have some people, I'm not sure who, from Rust Analyzer. You're here, right? Hopefully.
I'm here.
Cool. Lucas, excellent. Talking about Rust Analyzer and the approach that, some of the approaches that they've been taking there. Esteban giving a short notice on community metrics, some details about contributing to the CTCFT itself, and Jane talking about the contributor survey. So let's kick into the first talk. Well, we already did announcements. We saw some furry friends. But if anyone has any last minute things before we get started, now's your chance.
I just want to make a quick mention from the Rust Game Dev Working Group. We ran our first Rust graphics meetup at the beginning of October. So if you want to check that out, you can see what it looks like on our YouTube channel. If you just look up Rust Game Dev, it should be right there. And I wanted to just say that it was a very interesting format where we just had some people come and give talks. There wasn't like a whole bunch of overhead of like call for papers or anything, but we got some pretty cool results out of it. So if other teams are interested in running something like this, I have a lot of the infrastructure set up, and I would love to see more initiatives like this from a lot of the working and interest groups.
Wait, was it like a coding hackathon, or what exactly took place during the?
So for the graphics meetup, it was just 3 different presentations about the state of graphics generally in Rust. And so this month they revolved a lot around WGPU usage. And so there was like one talk about sort of deprecating GFX-RS and moving towards the future. There was a talk about Ren 3, which is an engine on top of WGPU. And then one talk about by WUMF about a project that's like fluid simulations in Rust.
Cool. That sounds cool. All right, then before we go, any other announcements? Okay, just want to give a brief overview of the ground rules. If you want to talk, please feel free, but the best thing is to turn on your video so that we see you kind of queued up there, but otherwise you can drop something in the chat and we'll let you know when's a good time, or raise your hand using the Zoom raise hand feature. And of course, we're abiding by the Rust Code of Conduct. And with that, I'll hand it over to Tyler. The question, Tyler, is, do you want me to drive the slides or do you want to?
Honestly, I think either way works.
Okay.
You can try it with you driving.
Then let's just do that. That's a little easier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Hey, everyone. I'm Tyler. I am one of the leads for the Async working group, Nico being the other one. And you can go to the next slide. So Nico actually gave a talk in the very first CTCFT about kind of the async vision process that we were doing. And I wanted to give people an update on that. Of course, I know not everyone was there. So very briefly, we asked people to write narratives that kind of captured their experience of using async today. People are actually using it sort of in the wild, so to speak. And Nico wrote a blog post on the main Rust blog, and we got actually a huge response from it. And we got about 50 stories that represented kind of different aspects of people's experience with using async. And let's see, sorry. And so from those 50 posts, we were able to kind of build up like a meta narrative, kind of a summary narrative of what it's like to use async today. So you can go to the next slide or show that. I'm not going to dive into this, but like these are kind of some of the high level points that we gathered. And then within those, there's a lot of like sub bullets, and you can point to individual stories that demonstrate this. So the next thing we asked people to do was to imagine the future of async and write narratives about how the experience should be actually in the future. And this turned out to be a little bit harder for people. Complaining about the present is easier than designing the future. It turns out that like because the status quo stories mostly kind of contain like implicit complaints about the way it is today, you know, it turned out to be kind of a good direction to just pick the opposite of that, which was helpful. So was all of this a success? I would say definitely. We got the feedback that we were looking for. We were able to identify like a lot of recurring themes and kind of get a feel for the challenges that people have today. It was definitely a lot of information. You know, one of the things that we've been wanting to do is roll up these 50 different stories into like 3 or 4 that kind of summarize everything and kind of capture the essence of all of them, that we could like realistically expect people to who are like really involved to kind of have some familiarity with, you know, something that we could kind of link back to as we do design. But we haven't had the time to do that yet. So after we got all of that, we talked about what to do next. And, you know, we had a lot of discussions around, you know, the next slide, you know, which things to do, which things to fix, what do we want to build, what are the interdependencies between those, and, you know, which things should we prioritize, because there's a lot of things to do. And, you know, these are kind of hard to define when you don't quite know exactly what you're building. You just kind of have a vague idea, but eventually we pieced together a roadmap, and yeah, you can click on it. I'm also going to go through kind of the structure of it over the next few slides. So how to roadmap. First thing we did was group all of the things that we wanted to do in these high-level goals. And these are focused around the end user experience that we want to create, which I think is important. It's not just around like, oh, these cool language features that I've been wanting for forever. Now, like you focus on the actual end user experience and like the aspects of that you want to enable. For every goal, we would state the specific impact that we're trying to achieve. And we also recruited owners for each of these goals who are responsible for making progress on that, which took some time, but was definitely worth it. So as an example here, we have the flexible async iteration goal, which, you know, first of all means that you are able to create async iterators. Yeah, they literally copied the text from from the website there. So you can create async iterators. You can compose them. You know, they obviously can await. You can await things within them, and then you can also create these, you know, large data computation graphs where things work in a predictable manner, and you know, you aren't really surprised by weird issues that involve buffering and things not being pulled, etc. So that's the high level goal. And, you know, this is basically a preview of, yeah, that's right. So this is a preview of the goals. They don't actually all fit on the slide, but all the ones that are actually, you know, staffed, if you will, are on here. So we have 4 that are kind of in progress right now, actively making progress. That's what the crab means. And you know, we didn't want to take too many things on, or, you know, worried it could get a little bit overwhelming, and just having your brain kind of being pulled in too many directions is something to keep in mind, even though we do have owners who are kind of owning their respective areas. So the goal defines what we're trying to accomplish, but not exactly how to do it. And so for the how, we need initiatives. You can go to the next slide. So here's the tooling goal from the roadmap, and then we have the 2 initiatives below it. So we have the console, which currently is under Tokyo, but eventually wants to be kind of a more general thing for like inspecting the async tasks that are actually running, and there's crash out debugging, which is basically being able to see all of your async tasks that are in progress, from a crash dump. So this is, post hoc debugging, and see like which tasks are awaiting which other task and things like that. So what defines an initiative? You could also call it a project. So you have one or more, well-defined features, meaning like you kind of know when you are done. And those features have a clear user impact. This is going to be a lot more clear-cut than the goals, which are kind of high level and may never be done. And often the initiatives are like really high context work. So, you'll have one person driving that initiative, and there might be a lot of like a bundle of things that are kind of interdependent on each other. And so we define milestones for each initiative that are like the high level things that we want to accomplish. So as an example, Eric is working on precise generator captures, which basically means that we don't think that you're holding variables over in a waypoint that you aren't really holding over in the waypoint. So I hope that makes some sense. But the point is that we break this initiative down into these different milestones, and this is like a pretty high level kind of small set of milestones that I think will get longer over time as we progress and like identify like new milestones on the way to stabilization. So to kind of help you think about goals and initiatives and milestones and like how big should these things be, the rule that I kind of followed, Nico and I kind of followed, was goals can be worked on in parallel. They're not like too dependent on each other. Initiatives can have dependencies between them, but they're high level. It shouldn't be like initiative A depends on like these 6 things from initiative B and these 3 other things from initiative C. It's more like initiative A depends on B, which depends on C. And then milestones within an initiative can have a lot more intricate sequencing because it's more high context, like I was saying. Yeah, next. Yeah, so the most important thing for all of this is that there's a lot of transparency, and like the where we are in the process, the thinking process is all documented somewhere. So Nico was showing the roadmap that we have online, and yeah, there are also a lot of so this is the Async Fundamentals Initiative repository. It has its own dedicated website. You can see, in the center, the set of subprojects and kind of like the high level progress on those. And then you have on the sidebar, you've got a lot of the design docs, regular updates. And so like someone who's not involved can actually go in and like is wondering like, oh, I wonder how they dealt with this X issue, and dig through the sidebar and find it. And what's really cool is that people can who actually know what they're talking about, but like aren't necessarily up to speed on what we're doing, can get up to speed and contribute in a meaningful way potentially. And we actually did have someone open a pull request out of the blue the other day to add a design doc, which is really cool. Let's see. So yeah, so Nico made this template for initiatives. So if you want to make an initiative repo, I think originally this was for language team initiatives, but like this idea is kind of generalizable. So you can just fork this repo and put up a website like really easily. And I already showed you this. So next I want to talk about the actual process that we're using to make progress. I see there's a chat. Okay, so Forrest asks, is there a lot of overhead to keeping it feeling dynamic, keeping the roadmap up to date? Yeah, I mean, there's some overhead, but I think it would be...
Just for the recording, I'll read the question.
Yeah.
I really love how this working group website looks. I'm wondering how much overhead there is to keeping it feeling very dynamic for a static site. For example, keeping the roadmap up to date, or just putting in the time to keep the documentation up to date. Is this a task that is put on the leads, or are all members encouraged to edit it frequently?
Yeah, so for the initiatives, and I should have said each initiative has an owner that may not be the same as the goal owner. And yeah, I mean, it's up to them to keep it up to date. But I would say, like for the async fundamentals, like we've just been pushing directly to master. We don't have a pull request workflow. It's just like a couple of people who have direct access to the repo just to make it a little bit easier. And like when we do things, like I'm going to write this design doc or draft this RFC, typically we do it in the repo. That's not 100% true. Sometimes it's in HackMD and then we transfer it to the repo. But like that's basically our scratch pad. And so that keeps the overhead down a little bit. And, like some things might not always get updated immediately, and that's okay. But like the idea is that you're very frequently updating the website. And so this kind of naturally just gets updated over time.
I wanted to add one thing, which is that at least the way I've been thinking about it is that there's like some using it as a scratch pad, as Tyler said, but B, like we have this updates column for monthly updates to the laying team. And so that gives a kind of natural, that's a good time when preparing that update. It's also a good time to do a sweep over the page and tweak any other things that may have fallen a little out of date. And that way it's not too far,
Yeah, good point. So hopefully I answered the question. Wait, go back. So I want to talk about the process that we're using to actually drive forward on this. We have biweekly sprints. And, at the beginning of every sprint, we'll have like a sprint planning meeting. We do these in Zulip. So all the goal owners are expected to attend, and then, others are also welcome as well. And, for the meetings, the first thing we do is we always do a retrospective on the last sprint. So I ask, which things worked well, what didn't work well, which things can we kind of iterate on and improve on. The next thing is assigning polish issues, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, we plan the goals for the next sprint. So one important thing to keep in mind is that, you always want sprint goals to be like very well scoped. And this took us a couple sprints to get right, but actually having goals that are like both well defined, meaning that exactly when you're done and are achievable within that 2-week time frame is important. And it can be really motivating to have both these regular meetings where you're checking in and having like these 2 goals that you can tick off one at a time. So wait, no, you went right. You should go down. Yes, thank you. So I mentioned polish issues earlier. What these are basically small little issues, or they can be big issues, but usually issues that could be conceivably fixed in a couple of weeks. That usually are like issues with error messages are like the biggest problem that we have today. And we decided not to make this like any one person's responsibility because honestly, like churning through these can be a little bit of a drag, and I mean, there's just a lot of them. So we decided to make it a shared team responsibility. So all of the goal owners every 2 weeks they pick up one polish issue that they're going to work on, and I think this has been working really well. Actually, we've been making a lot more progress on this stuff than we ever really have before. So it is a little bit of, you could say, overhead in addition to the like the actual goals that people are driving. But I mean, at the end of the day, we want to deliver a really good polished experience to users. And like, in order to do that, we need to fix these issues. So that really adds up over time. Things seem to be working. We've had good feedback from people who are participating in the process. And so, we've had like, I think 3 or 4 sprints at this point. So looking forward to what happens next. I guess it's only 3. Yeah, we're in the 4th. So there's one other thing that we're going to tackle next, which is stakeholders for the various initiatives. So for async fundamentals, we identified like, I think there's around 8 different people who kind of represent different users of async. And again, this is like pretty fundamental stuff. We're doing async functions and traits and den trait and async closures, etc. So there are a lot of different use cases that are really different. You have web services, you have operating systems, you have embedded, and so we came up with a list of people who could kind of represent these different perspectives and asked if they would do it. And so the plan is to have like monthly meetings with this set of stakeholders where we update them on what we're doing and we ask for their feedback. This can help solve the problem of it being like really like all of these people are interested in what we're doing, but it's really hard to keep up. They don't have time to like follow every commit that we push through a repo or anything. That's like, it's not really practical. So instead we're kind of going out to them and soliciting their feedback and kind of asking them specific questions about, will this thing work for you? And so we haven't actually done this yet. We've reached out to the stakeholders. We haven't followed through on any of that other stuff. So looking forward to seeing how that's going to go. Cool. And that's all I had for today. So if we have time, happy to answer any other questions that people have.
I guess I have one comment on the stakeholder thing. The way that I've been thinking of it, at least for a long time, we've talked about how the RFC process and so on is a great way to get feedback, but it comes kind of late in the design cycle. A lot of times you've already gone through all the trouble to write the RFC then, and B, it's not something that's accessible to everyone, especially production users or other people don't have time to keep up with the thread. So we're trying to kind of add to that with this extra process where we go out and bring in people who might not have been able to participate in and whose input we might just otherwise not have gotten. But
yeah, that's something I meant to bring up is that, I mean, the async RFCs historically have been a lot to keep up with, and they could get pretty contentious because of the fact that they're so late in the design cycle, and so we're hoping to avoid that.
any questions, or shall we move to the next item? All right. Well, thank you very much, Tyler. That was awesome. And next up, Lucas, I think. Be talking about Rust Analyzer. Lucas, did you want to take over the screen?
Yeah, I would like to.
Okay, I'll stop sharing. I think you should be able to share.
Is it working?
It's working.
Yep. All right.
Great. Take it away.
Yeah, for those that don't know me, I'm Lucas Wirt. I'm a member of the Rust Analyzer working group, and I'm going to talk about Rust Analyzer a bit. As a short start, Rust Analyzer started out as an error resilient parser, which over time just accumulated more and more language server features until it reached a state where it was actually usable as a backend for IDEs or for an actual language server implementation, which then sparked the idea of replacing the official Rust language server with Rust Analyzer itself, which is currently still in the works, but we are getting there soon. So differences between the language server, the current Rust language server and Rust Analyzer, for example, the main points would be that the Rust language server is using rustc itself to get semantic infos and so on, like what does this resolve to and all the interesting things. While in Rust Analyzer, we don't depend on the compiler internals at all. We only use it to basically generate diagnostics and lints from the compiler itself. So everything else is basically re-implemented in Rust Analyzer itself. So a few notable crates we use, for example, is the ungrammar crate and Rowan crate, inspired by C#'s rustlang compiler and Swift's lib syntax to use for our syntax trees. We use the same lexer as rustc, but we use our own custom parser, because our parser needs are a bit different from what the compiler has. So we had to basically hand wrote that ourselves. And there are currently also plans to lift out the Rust Analyzer parser into a proper standalone crate that can be reused itself. Then the main part Rust Analyzer is built upon is the salsa incremental database crate, which is similar to rustc's query system, and which is used to basically store the entire information about the project you're working on right now, basically. And we use the chalk crate for trait solving. For those that don't know, chalk is basically a re-implementation of the Rust trait system. So we are reusing that for our trait solving needs, which also makes us a great test bed, I guess, for finding bugs of chalk, since it's not really used by default in the original compiler yet. Then we've got a few big milestones we managed to get over the past years, one of which being semantic highlighting. This is pretty interesting because this is actually the part, or one of the parts in the Rust Analyzer code base that is the most advanced when it comes to semantic understanding, like knowing what are unsafe operations and similar things. And the problem is currently a lot of users don't really use it, because most themes in editors don't have semantic tokens for the Rust language specific stuff. So most of them just rely on the old known regex-based syntax highlighting, which has a slight disadvantage, which can be seen in the screenshot here. Basically, all the different colors in the imports are different types of items, like functions, traits, and structs. And semantic highlighting enables you to be able to highlight all of these differently in use statements, for example. But if this was simple regex-based highlighting, everything would have to have the same color, since you couldn't differentiate them just by their identifier, as the semantic info is basically missing. Then probably one of the most liked features that Rust Analyzer shipped pretty early compared to other extensions like this, except for the JetBrains IDEs, I suppose, is inlay hands, where we basically annotate types and parameter names right in your code where the information is relevant to see. So this way you don't have to hover over identifiers or similar to figure out what is the type of this, what is the function signature, or rather what is the parameter name of this function signature, and so on, which just helps a lot in being able to quickly understand code. And then we also had a big milestone with procedural macro and attribute support, whereas attributes we only recently enabled properly for expansion. And this is quite a huge point, because a lot of crates depend on these to generate items, generate impulse, and similar things. So without this support, a lot of crates just don't really work well with IDEs. An example would be the Bevy crate, I think, which uses a proc macro to implement traits on tuples, on different arity of tuples, to support function calls on them. And without those impulse, for example, using the Bevy crate is quite difficult because the IDE can't infer any types of functions calls anymore, because a lot of it goes through these implementations. And Rust Analyzer itself actually had a similar problem in that without attribute support, using it is a bit tricky because the salsa crate, the database crate we use the attributes to define the queries and the database signatures, basically. And that meant without having these expanded, Rust Analyzer couldn't really figure out what was the function call on a database object, for example. What does it return? Can't resolve those because it can't see them properly. So a lot of code actually just didn't have type inference or even completions because we couldn't see these kind of things yet. So having this support enabled made working Rust Analyzer a lot nicer as well. Of course, Rust Analyzer is not perfect, so we do have some problems, some more severe, some less. For one, we don't have error checking as you type, so we have to run cargo check every time we want to see actual rustc diagnostics and lints. We don't have a lot of the diagnostics employed in Rust Analyzer itself yet. There's no persistent state yet. So whenever you restart your Rust Analyzer, it has to re-index everything from the start, which is kind of slow for some projects, which hinders productivity, of course. Then completions are slower than we would like, which can be quite annoying because some clients refuse to show completions if they take too long. And proc macro ABI, well, the proc macro ABI is unfortunately unstable a bit. So whenever something changes in it on a nightly, it just breaks for every user of that nightly because the proc macro server is likely to crash when this happens. This unfortunately forces us to support different ABIs, usually about 3, which is latest stable, latest nightly, and beta, I think. So anything using another ABI than these 3 will usually result in a crash, which is not something we can, of course, at the moment address. Our type inference does not always agree with Rust. It's not quite feature complete, so we can't fully show our own type mismatches yet, but we are getting there. Similarly, we don't support const generics yet, which is a problem for some crates like Algebra, where a lot of const genericness is used for matrices and so on. And similarly, we don't support lifetimes at the moment, though that's not really a problem since we can just replace every lifetime with static, and it usually works for everything. Yeah, then the more on topic part, I suppose, the contributor experience. Basically, to help getting started, we have architecture docs and videos explaining these things. And the style guide. Basically, the architecture docs are more about how does Rust Analyzer work in the big picture, and the style guide is basically do's and don'ts about specific patterns, whether we like them or not. The nice part about the style guide architecture docs thing is when we review something and we see something that looks like a mistake or something that goes against our style, that is probably repeatable by people, we can just note it down in the style guide and then just put a link in the review to the style guide part that we added. That way we constantly expand the architecture docs and style guide docs, so we accumulate more information for the project over time this way. And another point is we don't really use Clippy actively because some defaults are style-wise at least questionable subjectively. So we prefer specific patterns that Clippy does not like that much, which is why we accept Clippy PRs usually, but sometimes we reject some of the lints that were fixed because we don't agree with them. Then some differences regarding how rustlang does things compared to Rust, the main rustc repository, I suppose. We target the latest stable Rust at any time, so we don't rely on compiler internals or nightly features. This has the effect that it's easier to reuse as a library for people, as well as building for new contributors, because you can usually expect people to have the latest stable Rust or be able to target latest stable Rust than it is for them to have a nightly install with the feature set that we would need. Similarly, the entry bar is quite low. It's basically just cargo. So all you need to do is basically clone the repository and then cargo test, and you just tested the entire Rust analyzer test suite. We merge pull requests optimistically and prefer refactoring them later if needed. That has the nice benefit that if PR gets merged fast, it's less likely to get stale and be forgotten. Because if it takes too long to get a PR merged, usually what happens is that people don't have time to work on the PR more because they have other things to do, of course, which might result in them forgetting about the PR or forgetting what they had to do in there, and which just maybe results in DPR at the end just being closed or never merged. Though unfortunately we don't auto assign reviewers because not everyone knows how to review a certain PR, which of course then has the problem that some PRs maybe never get reviewed for a long time, which goes a bit against this idea again. Then short thing about our meetings. We basically have two types of meetings. Weekly sync meeting, which is just, well, a meeting that we have every Monday, where we just shortly talk about what happened the last week, any major issues that appeared, anything interesting that someone worked on, just to, well, get everyone on sync of what the week basically covered. And then we also have a 6-week meeting, recurring 6-week meeting. That is our steering meeting, and in that we basically just plan ahead. What should we prioritize for the next 6 weeks? Is there anything that might be nice to work on for the next time? This isn't really strict in a sense, though, that we have to work on these points that we put down now, but more of a directional thing. So we try to push these points forward, but if it doesn't work out, that's fine as well. Then a quick showcase. As said, Rust analyzer can be used as a library, though with an unstable API. And that what is already being used for some things. Here's a small list of things that we know of, including a Jupyter kernel and REPL, and other fun things like playground integration and so on. And lastly, well, what's next in SHIP? For one, we should probably try getting const generics further, though this is unfortunately quite a big issue. So that might take a big bunch of time. Basically, we don't know if this will come in the near future, but it would be quite nice to have. Then we are pushing for libraryfying rustc's exhaustiveness checking, which is actually making some progress last I've seen. So ideally, that would mean we could replace our own copy of the exhaustiveness check, which is not quite working. There are a few parts that are just failing on even the standard library. There's one match that we don't properly check, I think. So having this replaced with the actual rustc implementation would be quite a step forward with this. And lastly, we have a small request for procedural attribute macro authors. Basically, since we ship attribute expansion by default now. There was a bunch of problems that appeared due to how proc macro authors write their proc macros in terms of errors, including how syn handles it. Basically, try to recover on pass errors. Don't just discard the input and emit a compile error. The problem with this is basically if there's a function that has an attribute annotation on it, and the user types any expression in the function that causes a temporary syntax error, the entire item gets replaced by the compile error because that's how the proc macro is written. And due to this, we basically lose all IDE features for the time until the syntax error is fixed. So ideally, try considering not using syn unless you really need to, and handle errors properly by not discarding everything, or maybe explore an alternative to syn that is infallible, that has better recovery in that sense. Yeah, that was all I had basically.
Great, thank you very much. Lucas, that was really interesting. We have time for a question or two. If anyone has any, there are some in the chat, but they've been answered by Lauren Chu. Don't know how to pronounce your name, sorry. But any other questions, or should we move forward? Tyler?
Yeah, I was wondering if there are any plans to make or stabilize any part of the Rust Analyzer API.
Not for the near future, as far as I know, because a lot of parts are still moving quite a lot since we don't really have figured out what is the best API for this, what is the best API for this. So it's constantly changing for our internal needs, basically. So there's probably going to be quite some time until any of that becomes somewhat stable.
Makes
I
sense.
have a question, Lucas. How important do you think it is that Rust Analyzer builds on stable and that it has a kind of cargo test workflow for contributors?
Quite important, I think, because being able to just invoke cargo for everything makes things, of course, easier. And I think it's a lot more friendly for new contributions or contributors, especially people that are quite new to Rust still, because they, of course, don't want to have to invoke some other script that has nothing to do with how Rust usually works in regards to building.
Right.
So I would rate that quite highly, I guess.
Okay, great. Well, we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to jump forward, but hopefully you all will be around in the social hour if people have more questions. And thanks again. Esteban, are you here?
I am.
Do you want to share?
Go ahead and do you want to present?
I can go ahead and share it if you prefer.
Yeah,
Either
I
way.
think that,
Okay.
and I can, yeah.
There you go.
Cool. So I'm Esteban. Most of you will know me by either being a member of the Rust compiler team or being very annoying on Twitter asking for people to file tickets. I wanted to talk about community metrics, which I'm going to be blazing past because I only have 5 minutes, but you may be intrigued about what I mean by that. But before actually talking about the metrics themselves, I want to talk about the state of the project as I see it. We've had a very eventful year. Rust is as big as ever. The foundation was created. The edition 2021 was delivered by a lot of great work that a lot of people did. And if you look beyond just what we may call the Rust compiler and the associated tooling, if we look beyond that, Rust, if you look at what Rust itself is the surrounding tooling, next slide, the documentation, the ecosystem, and most important of all is the people. And those people, next slide, may belong to some of the official teams, may be part of one or multiple working groups, maybe individual contributors, or they may be writing documentation, or they may be crate maintainers. All of those things make Rust what it is. And the thing is, because with growth, something else also comes, which is the inefficiencies of communication. Next slide. The problems of being able to know what the current state of things are, and particularly if you want to get a global view. If you look at, for example, what Tyler was showing earlier, there is a lot of management work that is required in order to figure out what one specific project is doing. And we currently don't really have any good way of looking at what the entire ecosystem is doing and where are resources needed, where are people that may be burning out are. And you can ask one-on-one, people one-on-one how they are and how their projects are going, but that doesn't really scale beyond a certain size. Next slide. And because of that, there is a management tool that we could use in the project for ourselves. Next slide, which is what I meant by community metrics. Trying to collect data, hard numbers that can let us see and answer those questions. Of course, any automated tool is not going to really give you, it's not the beginning and end. Next slide. The idea is just to have a way of measuring whether we're actually making an impact when we're trying to make a change. Like, for example, if we want to drive down the time that PRs are left open without a review, having metrics for that would be very valuable to know if we are actually making an impact. But it's also a way of shining a spotlight on some things that may be problematic. Like, for example, we could identify somebody who is putting in a lot of work, and we can then follow up with them and talk with them one-on-one and actually figure out whether they need help, if they are fine the way they are. But having metrics will actually helps us shine that light and focus on where to ask follow-up questions. Next slide. The work that people have been doing on Optopody was presented a few meetings ago. It's a tool to collect metrics from a curated set of GitHub projects. It was started by Nico Duckjones, that I believe is present, and Chas Kiker did a lot of great work on that. I think it's one of the things that we need to be investing heavily in, and that can let us answer some of the questions that I showed earlier. Of course, any questions that we may come up with, they are not going to be necessarily right at the beginning. They may not tell the full story, but I think that the exercise of just coming up with the questions themselves is going to be helpful. And next slide, I do think that as a community, it's something that is going to be very valuable to all of us. As I mentioned earlier, I'm concerned that maybe we are reaching the limits of our existing organization schemes. And I really want us to be able to tackle bigger, more ambitious projects. Not that we haven't in the past, but thinking back to the 2018 edition, that burned a lot of people up. And I want to avoid that. I want to make sure that Rust is healthy and sustainable over time. I want everybody that is in the community to be comfortable with the contributions that they make. And I want more and more people to join. And I believe that this is something that is going to help us. Of course, I only had 5 minutes and I may have blown past them, but if you do have thoughts about this, please seek me out during the social hour. I'm looking for feedback about this, and I'm going to be trying to reach to more and more people in the community for feedback after this. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Esteban. I'm going to just hustle things along because we're coming right at the end of the hour. Forrest, did you want to give a quick update here?
Yeah, for sure. And so we can just go to the next slide. So this is an update about the CTCFT. So we're almost a team. We're working on seeing if you can become like a sub team of the Rust community team. So right now we have several people who are sort of working in different roles to make the CTCFTs happen. And if you're interested, you can reach out to me on Zulip. I'm just Angel on Fireta or Forest, either way. Next slide. And so the items that we're working on, primarily we're trying to just take as much of the workload off of Nico as possible. And so what this means is working collectively together to find people to give talks each month. And then also just figuring out how to get more teams and more people involved from our collective experiences. Next slide. And so the big item that we want to try and work on right now is starting a lot more of the planning in the open. And so for people who don't want to invest on like doing a lot of the organizational side of the team, we're hoping that they can still contribute and say, this is a talk that I'd like to see, or I think you should reach out to this person and see if they'd be willing to give a talk. And next slide. And so for yourself, you can participate with this in a few different ways. We have several different sections of each CTCFT. So for the announcements, we're looking for announcements about practices that other teams might like to adopt, changes to teams, just general updates that would be relevant to people on other teams. We have, when you're suggesting a talk, we're very often looking for talks that like whose audience would ideally be other Rust teams. And so not necessarily anything that's too technical that you'd find at a conference or something like that. But when you're able to address all of these different people on like so many different teams, there's a lot of subjects that we tend to see that fit really well in the CTCFT. But then also calling us out a little bit, figuring out what we can do better. And so, for example, and yeah, you can next slide, we have, we should be working on more outreach. And this was something that was brought up recently, how we're not really checking to see who's attending the CTCFTs. And so, for example, teams who might never have heard of it before or just don't have a lot of members on it, we would love to have some representation from every team come out to the CTCFT. And so just working towards either doing some type of attendance or just figuring out that we do have this representation. But that's about it. And I hope that next month we'll be able to show off the CTCFT as a full team.
Thank you. That was awesome. And I want to just add that in the pound CTCFT stream in Zulip, people can jump in. We're already talking a bit about what to do for next time. Jane, did you want to talk briefly about the contributor survey?
Yes, we'll make this one quick.
Awesome.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so contributor survey, for everyone who is not already familiar, I have been working on this survey for the Rust Foundation, and the goal of the survey is, or first, like, let's go back. Yeah, the home of the survey is in rustlang/surveys under the 2021's contributor survey. And then next slide, goals. So the goal of the contributor survey is, it's very similar to what Esteban was talking about, where like you can have this information, you can get these metrics, but you also need to talk to people. And so we're trying to like systematically talk to everyone and basically get an idea of what how everyone is feeling. Not so much like, it's like we have the community survey that's talking about how people use Rust. This is more about the development experience. What's it like maintaining the Rust project itself? What are the problems people run into when maintaining the project? Like, what are the biggest issues that we should be addressing, et cetera, et cetera. And so next slide. So just kind of got ahead of myself a bit, but these are the issues. Like, what are the biggest issues? What are the causes of issues that we're already aware of? Like, there's, I think, a general feeling that burnout is relatively common, either currently or historically. So we want to basically, anything that we kind of know about, also ask questions to kind of figure out the causes of those. Similarly, there are some teams that seem to be doing better than others and trying to figure out what what are the elements of the teams that are healthy versus the teams that are unhealthy, and like all together gather all this information about the contribution experience to guide the work the foundation is doing, like the program. So I guess the next one, the audience, like who is this work for? This is mostly for the foundation, but also just anyone who's doing governance or any other kind of high level planning for how to run a project. And we want to make this information available so they can like basically like make changes. Like if for team leads, if we figure out like these are the things that work well that you're not doing that we think might help, we want to get that information to those team leads as well, and just generally kind of improve the sustainability of the project overall. And that's it. Sorry, that was like really fast, but there will be a lot more time for talk during the social hour. So I'm really excited to see what everyone thinks of the survey and get feedback and hopefully get it launched soon. So that's it.
Awesome. Then thanks everybody for coming, and that's the end of our scheduled content. I'm going to stop the recording, but after this, we're going to have social hour, time to talk, ask questions, and just relax, so they can be discussing about kind of different topics, whether you want to follow up on some of the things that were brought up here, like the contributor survey, or Esteban would like to talk about metrics, or if you just want to get to know some people from the Rust community better. The way we usually run it is that I hand off to Jane, and Jane creates a bunch of breakout rooms, and you can join whichever one you prefer. So let me stop the recording, and we'll make that happen, and you can go get a drink of water or something.
Yeah, I'm gonna make 2